Hey guys, welcome back. So now we are getting into our talks of King in Black, Symbiote Spider-Man. But this time around, we're going to group a few things together. Like in this case, for this video, we're going to talk about issues 1 and 2, and likely we'll do the same for 3 and 4, haven't decided yet, because overall there's just a lot of stuff I want to get into. And with Symbiote Spider-Man now rolling in a new member to Knull's family, who also has a bit of history with Captain Universe, and it has me thinking like, this could roll into something pretty interesting. So I figured, hey, we should dive in. But before we do, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squad up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so jumping into the first issue of King in Black Symbiote Spider-Man. First, I want to clear up for like the general reader that this story, much like the other Symbiote Spider-Man stories that we've covered, like Symbiote Spider-Man Alien Reality, or just Symbiote Spider-Man, that these all take place in the past. And even though certain issues or collections of Symbiote Spider-Man cross over into current day events, the Symbiote Spider-Man series within themselves, they just fill in new narratives between the time that Peter returned from the first Secret Wars and go forward from there, just filling in new narratives that just land in between previous Spider-Man stories that we know. And with doing this, like at times we get a rough reference to when some of this stuff happened, but for the most part these narratives are just like fun ways to throw in stuff retroactively within a number of short stories, just to kind of be like, hey, look what happened back then. And because of that, they're very contained when we jump from one Symbiote Spider-Man story to the next. But jumping into King in Black, Symbiote Spider-Man, where we start off with Alistair Smythe, who's formerly known as a Spider Slayer and is currently being held at the Ravencroft Institute for the Criminally Insane. And it's here where he's visited by someone who he believes to be his father, with this person showing up with the appearance of his father, Spencer Smythe, but then quickly telling Alistair that he only chose this appearance because this appearance was visually less intimidating, because he didn't want to just pop up and spook the guy. But then it's here where the visitor tells Alistair that his previous host was Lewis Tuttle, and Lewis got incinerated some time back, and that's where Alistair's part comes in, because the visitor wants him as a host to make his way to the Ravencroft laboratories, which as we know are usually used to experiment on criminals. And once Alistair gets there, the visitor will give him instructions for a formula to make to inject himself with, and then after doing so, he would then spread it through the clinic's ventilation system. And in exchange, the visitor had told him that if he agreed to do so, then he would grant him the use of his legs again. And with hearing this, Alistair agreed. But then after this, we then jump over to Spider-Man, who saves this kid named Orson, who initially made me think of Orson Randall, but pretty sure it's not him. But Spider-Man saves this kid from running into the street, chasing after a balloon, and he just webs him to a light post. But when the kid's mom comes to get him, and she asks him like, who saved you? And he was like, Daredevil. And even Peter has a SMH moment when he hears the kid say this. But Peter's used to saving lives and other people getting the credit. And not long after this, Peter makes his way into the Daily Bugle, and it's here that we find out that Alistair Smythe, he had reached out from Ravencroft in order to see J. Jonah Jameson, but Jameson ended up sending Peter with Ned Leeds instead. But then it's here where we jump over to Uatu the Watcher, which is another hint to kind of let us know that this is well before Original Sin. But with us seeing Uatu the Watcher here, he's mainly just doing as he normally does, just watching, looking down on Earth and just judging people. And I say he's watching like he normally does, like he doesn't jump in all the time. But this time that wasn't quite the case, because while he was up here on the moon, he's then abducted by a ship which he didn't see coming. And once he's taken aboard this ship, it's quickly that we find out that this was done by Kang the Conqueror, who Uatu immediately recognizes, but still he doesn't know why Kang had abducted him. And really just from what we know of Kang's history in the future, and it feels weird just saying that. But what we know from Kang's background, a lot of the time his records from present day events, they're not always 100% accurate, which is the main reason why in this case he had came and got the Watcher, who has thousands of years of history stored within him, so that Kang can then extract it with his machine in order to save the universe. But when Kang had started this procedure, he was unaware of the Watcher's psionic powers, which as a result then allowed Uatu to absorb the information from Kang's database, which allowed Uatu to see the past, eons before his own existence, and also the future which Kang had came from. And when Uatu looks into this future, it looks back at him. But with this happening, it threw Kang's ship completely into haywire mode. And he tried to do like the voice command deactivation thing, but that didn't work, which feels very accurate, because I know we all had that moment where you tell your phone to turn on the lights or something, but instead it just calls your ex on speaker, and as a result, you find yourself in the dark, explaining yourself for a number of things you just can't remember. And I mean, like, we've all had that moment, right? I'm just gonna imagine that everybody nodded their head. But when this happens, it destroys Kang's ship, and he's left adrift in space until soon after he's then approached by a ship that had just happened to be the Rack and Ruin 2, and it's here where he's then picked up by Rocket Raccoon. But back down on Earth, within the Ravencroft Institute, it's here where we jump over to Alistair Smythe, who we see carrying out the instructions which he was given by the Visitor. And after creating this mixture as he was instructed, and then also injecting himself with it, it then spreads throughout the Ravencroft clinic, and shortly after, he looks out the window to where we see him say, "It's starting." And when this happens, Peter and Ned are making their way in, but Peter stops because his spider sense goes off, and when he looks up, he sees an eclipse forming in front of the sun. And it's very out of place because, like, an eclipse doesn't just come out of the blue. But we come to find out that this is the beginning of a manifestation of the Shadow Realm, which appears at this time in the past because of present day events with King in Black. And with seeing it, Alistair mentions that his lord won't be sorry for giving him this second chance. And we'll talk more on that in a little bit. But then it's also here where Alistair notices that Jameson didn't come himself. And with Alistair being under the influence of the Visitor, who we'll talk about more in a minute, he then takes Ned, turning him into one of the Shadow Slaves, making him turn on Peter, who quickly suits up with his symbiote immediately after. And when this happens, you have Ned plus the rest of the staff from the clinic who all come for Peter at once, and it's kind of a weird moment because they're surprised to see Peter, or at least the symbiote that he's wearing for that matter. But with Peter figuring like if he goes to the source of what's causing this, then he can pretty much figure out what's going on, and to do so he then follows his spider sense, but instead of going away from the problem, he just goes closer, which is what then leads him to Smythe, who then reveals that he was Mr. E all along. Insert song. But so it's here where I want to talk about a bit of history on Mr. E. Because back when we got his first appearance within Marvel Spotlight Volume 2, Issue 9, Mr. E back at the time was mainly described as this creature from the Shadow Realm who had escaped and made his way into the main reality, and he had concocted this elaborate plan to turn the sun into a black star, and with doing so he intended to turn the rest of the world and the rest of the universe into Shadow Slaves, which initially was like a precursor for an invasion from the Shadowverse. But at the time, not only did he want to do this to create a Shadowverse of his own, but then also to take this army that he's built and use it to take over his own dimension as well. But at this point in time, these plans were stopped by Captain Universe, who was a sophomore kid by the name of Steve Coffin, who had taken over as Captain Universe after his father, Ray Coffin. But Steve had pretty much ended this by punching the ship, which killed everybody on it, I'm sure. But he did this in order to keep it from flying into the sun, which then would have turned it into a black star, which would have potentially threatened the universe. But since this had happened, Mr. E had still somehow survived. And if I had to guess to like how he survived, we'll probably see later that it had something to do with the Shadow Realm and how it kind of has this loophole between what's happening at this point in time and also the events to come in the future. But when Peter gets here and he finds that it's Mr. E looks to him, he says brother, and they kind of get this reach for a handshake, get a hug kind of moment. And with Peter fighting him off, like initially it works, but not long after, his punches go straight through. But it's here where Mr. E then tells Peter that not only are they kin, but also that they're people, and referring to Mr. E and the symbiote, that they were there at the beginning and they will continue to be there at the end. And keep in mind that all of this really doesn't make sense to Peter, because for the most part he just believes that he has a high-tech alien suit, and the ways that it responds to his thoughts and even thinks on its own to protect him, like he thinks all of those are just features that come along with it. But it's also here while confronting Mr. E that Peter realizes like the way he was able to make contact with Ned, it was mainly by just moving without thinking. And with doing so, more or less the suit just did the rest. And that's what Peter does here, and immediately he makes contact with Mr. E and he's once again able to fight back. And right after this happens, the Ebony Blade then comes flying in, impaling Mr. E, which also brings the arrival of Black Knight, who around this time was one of your main Avengers. And when Black Knight arrives, like he asks Mr. E if like the eclipse, like if this was his doing, and in response Mr. E, he tells them like creation moves forward, but uncreation, it moves backwards, which I feel like is another tease towards like the time displacement in relation to the Shadow Realm. But after Mr. E escapes from the Ebony Blade and Spider-Man and Black Knight are trying to sort out like what's going on, Black Knight then tells Spider-Man that he was sent there by Merlin, who had more or less filled in Black Knight by the way of a dream. And as soon as he says that, Merlin just pops up. And when he does, scaring the mess out of Peter, he then tells Peter that Ned is making his way back with the Shadow over to the Daily Bugle, which lets Peter know right away that he's going to kill Jamerson, But then also for a moment, Black Knight, he kind of gives Merlin the side eye with him popping up here in person because it's not usually his form of delivery. And it's here where we then jump over to Ned, who's fighting with the influence of Mr. E, but even with doing so it's useless because he's not able to break out. But over at the Daily Bugle, with Jamerson getting ready to leave after firing an employee by the name of Neil, with the middle name DeGrasse, and we didn't get a last name, so we don't know if it was Tyson or not. But after firing him, Jamerson was like, he's gonna wind up teaching science to 8th graders, watch. And like, I really want to follow up on that, like in the Marvel universe, of course, like just to see how that played out. But just before Jamerson leaves, Ned then shows up, and Jamerson just takes off, and like he doesn't even know what's going on exactly, but like whatever it is, he's pretty sure that Spider-Man did it. Like it must be easy to give the same answer to every situation, like no matter what it is. But then when Jamerson makes his way to the stairs, Ned then cuts him off in the stairway, telling Jamerson that it's too bad that Spider-Man isn't there. And just like that, Spider-Man comes crashing in, saving Jamerson and sending Ned down the stairway, fighting him while he's under the control of one of Mr. E's shadows. And even when this happens, even with Spider-Man saving Jamerson in the nick of time, Jameson's just like, you know, I'm gonna bill you for that skylight. But really, like, had Spider-Man taken another way in that was more cost effective, then there's really no telling what would have happened to Jamerson in that moment. But then it's also here, like at the lower levels of the Daily Bugle, where Peter's going back and forth with Mr. E, who then leaves Ned's body like on a printing press and just leaving him there to roll up to his imminent death. But with doing this, Mr. E's shadow leaves Ned, saying that he believes that it's time that he moves on. And when this happens, Peter has to hurry up and save Ned before he literally makes the front page and becomes breaking news. But when Peter pulls him off, Ned lets him know that when he was connected to that shadow, it's like a two-way street, and that when the shadow had left him, it was making its way to Avengers Mansion. And at this point in time, this is where the Black Knight is arriving at the Avengers Mansion, and when he does, he gets the reappearance of Merlin. And Merlin tells him that this eclipse that's happening is coming from a great evil that can only be stopped by the Ebony Blade, and that this great evil goes by the name of Knull. And it's here where Merlin tells the Black Knight that though at this current time Knull is contained, but at some point in the future, him getting out is inevitable. And when he does get out, he will be a threat to all time and space. And Merlin tells him that it is his belief that Knull is vulnerable to the Ebony Blade, and it's possible that this could be the key to defeating him. And with saying this, Merlin offers to increase the magic of the Ebony Blade, but just before Black Knight hands it over, he asks Merlin like what's his real name. And Merlin kind of trips up like, man, you a D-lister, man, come on. Now he ain't say that, but at this time it is made clear that this wasn't Merlin, but instead this was Mr. E, who then tells the Black Knight that when he had stabbed Mr. E with the Ebony Blade, that one, it allowed him to take over the sword, but then also two, everything that Mr. E had said about the Ebony Blade and about Knull's history and him being a threat to the past and future, that all of that was true, and that the only true deception that had come from Mr. E had really just been about whose side he was on. And with Mr. E taking the Ebony Blade and leaving the Black Knight for dead, it isn't much long after to where Kang and Rocket arrive at the Avengers Mansion, finding the Black Knight barely hanging on for his life, which is where we'll leave off for this one before we continue with part 3. Alright, so jumping back in part 3, it comes in around the time where Peter's heading to the Avengers Mansion after hearing from Ned that Mr. E will be going for the Black Knight, with Ned being one of Mr. E's shadow creatures for a moment, which allowed Ned to see some of Mr. E's intentions. But even with Peter rushing back, like he wasn't there in time to help Dane, and as a result, Mr. E took the Ebony Blade and stabbed the Black Knight with his own sword. And on top of that, before Peter could reach, Dane was also found by Kang and Rocket Raccoon, who had then taken him shortly after to tend to his wounds. But in the case of Peter, who's making his way over there like as fast as he can swing, and when he gets there, like he doesn't go straight for the Black Knight because he believes that he's down there along with Merlin, and at this time that Mr. E's on the way. So when Peter gets there and he sees like one of the new Quinjets, which Tony's designed that can go faster than the speed of light, Peter then tries to get the jet's attention because he believes that either Tony or some other Avengers are on it, so he jumps on it to kind of wave them down and tell them who's on their way so he can get their help. But when Peter jumps on the prototype Quinjet, he looks inside and it's none other than Mr. E, stealing another jet. Or I guess last time it was technically a space shuttle. But either way, like this guy's got a pattern, man. And like out of all the information which he's taken from other hosts, like Lewis Tuttle, the NASA scientist, like Mr. E, he has used some of it for engineering, but even in that case, like he still uses all that engineering and that knowledge for boosting rocket ships. And every time he has a plan, he's gonna need a rocket. But when he sees Peter and more or less gets him off by putting up the Quinjet shields, Peter is then caught by Kang in Rocket's ship. And from there, there, when Peter more or less comes to and figures out what happened, with much gratitude, he looks at Kang and then kicks the mess out of him. And really, this is one of those things to where, like, you have a villain who's trying to do good, and in every case that another hero comes along, they have got to explain themselves, and with doing so, usually the fighting comes first. And even in this case, like, it doesn't help that his name is Kang the Conqueror, because apparently with that name, you gonna catch the paws on sight. But even with this, like, also in this case, Peter has a bit of suspicion that Kang is involved somehow with Mr. E. And it isn't really until this fight is fizzled down and Rocket also steps in to where Peter finds out that Kang is actually telling the truth and that he's really here to help. And at this point, Kang and Rocket, they show Spider-Man that they've taken in the Black Knight, as well as a few others who at one point had became Mr. E's shadow slaves, and Kang more or less makes sense out of the idea that he would want to save the universe, which is why he came here in the first place, and is also why he's helping to heal the Black Knight. But also with Kang explaining more of the details of the situation to Spider-Man, Kang also tells him that he knows these guys, and Peter mentions that they've often told him that him and Mr. E are the Spider Slaves, that they're in some way related, but Peter doesn't fully understand, and from there Kang kinda drops the conversation, and he tells Peter that he'll find out in due time. But right after that, when Kang starts talking to the shadow creature, which he has contained, the creature starts giving all these threats on how it's gonna kill everybody here, and Kang more or less is like, yeah, that's interesting, but I pretty much got all these containers set up to extract every shadow creature from its host to where it can then just spit them out into a nearby passing sun. Which is precisely what Kang does when he expels this shadow creature, and he gives them the old-fashioned Captain Universe treatment. But as soon as this happens, we then see the host who was previously taken over by the shadow creature, who at this time is Captain Marvel, Monica Rambeau. And when Spider-Man sees her and is like, hey, that's Captain Marvel, Rocket's kind of like, nah, Captain Marvel's a Kree guy. But Spider-Man's like, nope, not anymore. But then it's here like when Monica wakes up and she recognizes Spider-Man, but then when she sees Kang, it's like it's on and popping again. And she's able to quickly get out of her containment by going infrared, but then when she goes after Kang, he quickly puts his shields up and Monica just bounces right off. But this time the fight isn't as long because Rocket jumps in sooner, and the attention is then taken towards the talking raccoon, who's named after a Beatles song. But not long after this, Kang and Rocket, they fill in Monica and Peter, letting them know that Mr. E has taken the Ebony Blade, and Monica also shares what she learned from the shadow creature when she was taken, which is how they come to the conclusion that Mr. E wants to destroy it. So then now, to find Mr. E, they now have to find out how to destroy it, because knowing this will lead them right to him. And at first, Peter's like, we'll just throw it into the sun. But then the Black Knight wakes up and he tells him that throwing it into the sun like that just won't work. And the reason why is because when Merlin had forged the Ebony Blade from the Star Stone, Merlin had to use heat and magic to craft it. And for that reason, like, just throwing it into the sun won't work. Like, heroes swear that's the answer to everything, just throw it in the sun. But after discussing the creation of the Ebony Blade, Monica then tells them that there's no question like where Mr. E is trying to take it, which as it turns out would have to be nowhere, which is the severed head of a Celestial, thanks to Knull, which later got converted into a supermarket, or better yet more of a flea market. Not to mention that this is also where Knull had created the Necro Sword. But it also makes sense for Mr. E to bring it here because this is also a place where rare weapons are made. And because of that, it's not too off of an idea that you would find someone here who forges and uses magic to create powerful weapons for a bargain. And this is exactly the type of person who Mr. E would need to find to have the skills to destroy the Ebony Blade. And in this case, it turns out to be a troll by the name of Ulissa, and I kind of like the way that this is done because she's a troll in Troll's Craft using magic, but also this isn't like your case to where you're looking for this rare person and there's somewhere up on a mountaintop thinking about knowledge. And it's like when you think about it with a bit of a realistic perspective, usually people with that kind of value, they're not just sitting around doing nothing. And this is what I like about the inclusion of Ulissa, because with her being needed and Mr. E finding her here, she's out here like, yo, I'm trying to get this paper. Or better yet, credits in this case. But then on top of Mr. E arriving here and soliciting Ulissa's services, they are then met by the arrival of her brother, Ulick, who at this time Ulissa had been hiding from, and mainly because of the whole troll custom of killing their siblings. But recently Ulick had got a tip that he should come and get the Ebony Blade here, but we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But with Ulick crashing the party, so to speak, which then gives Mr. E the opportunity to just go in with the combo. And with doing so, like, Mr. E, he nearly finishes Ulick like super quick, but he's then stopped by Ulissa, who more or less tells him like she doesn't want to kill her brother, but if anybody does kill her brother, then it's gonna be her. Which once again takes us back to the whole troll custom thing. which is weird, but at the same time, it's like their survival of the fittest solution, more or less. But at this point, their confrontation's then broken up by the head of security, Cosmo the Space Dog. And with this happening, like, it then gives Ulick the chance to try to go after Mr. E again, but because the first time Ulick didn't get a swing in, he also didn't realize, like, this dude is intangible, with very few exceptions. And I'm not gonna front, like, if Mr. E had only held the ebony blade behind his back in this moment, like, this could have been a brutality. Missed opportunity, Mr. E, missed opportunity. But also when this happens, Spider-Man and the others arrive, and when Peter gets there, he hits Mr. E with the Obi-Wan Kenobi Star Wars quote, which at this point in time wouldn't be a really old movie, but rather something that was recent in theaters. Ah man, theaters. Y'all remember those? Man, like, hopefully we get them back by next Christmas, because as of right now, that's the only place that Spider-Man No Way Home is premiering. So fingers crossed that everything just falls into place. But in the case of Spider-Man going up against Mr. E, both Rocket and Kang, they then make their way in, but Rocket's blast, they just go through Mr. E, nearly hitting Spider-Man, and then on top of that, Mr. E also uses the ebony blade to absorb the energy from some of the blasts and send it right back at Rocket and Kang. So at this point, Mr. E, like, he's adapting to all their attacks pretty well, because he's also figured out how to make himself intangible to Spider-Man and his symbiote again. But then this is also where Monica Rambeau steps in. Because when she arrives, like, she's now figured out to this point that if she fills Mr. E with ultraviolet light, that this would then solidify him and keep him still so the others can attack. And it's pretty clever because Monica, she's essentially using one of Mr. E's tactics on himself, because the same way Mr. E would take a host and take their knowledge and combine it with what he knows to get what he wants, Monica has essentially done the same thing. Because for her, after being bonded with the shadow creature, she's then learned their weaknesses, and because of that, she knows what type of light to transform into now in order to stop him in his tracks. And for Monica, it's not like she always has to see a light or absorb it in order to duplicate it, but it's like if she needs to, she can, but if she just knows that a specific type of light is what she needs, she can either produce it or just become it, as long as she's been aware to that spectrum prior to this point. And in this moment, it comes in really clutch, because without her, like, they would have been in trouble. But with her holding Mr. E still, Spider-Man then gets in a punch, which wasn't necessary, but then Rocket shoots the ebony blade out of his hand, and Kang uses his separation algorithm to send Mr. E back into a containment back on Rocket's ship, which as a result then frees Smythe, and they take him aboard shortly after. And so from here, they gotta kind of come to a solution as far as where to take Mr. E or what to do with him. And as a result, they then take him to the Collector, which is a more reasonable solution, since we know that the Captain Universe throw him into the sun thing was a no-go. But the funny thing is, like, not long after they bring Mr. E to the Collector, Peter's then like, wait a minute, like, who got the sword? Because apparently everybody was just so excited about getting Mr. E and taking him in, and I guess figuring out where they were gonna take him, that nobody really thought to pick up the ebony blade along the way. And it's here where we jump back to nowhere that we find out that Ulick, he had actually been sent here by someone to retrieve the ebony blade, which is how he had popped up here in the first place. And when Peter, Kang, and the others go back to nowhere to pick up the ebony blade, they come to find that Ulick is still there. And mainly because he was still trying to kill Ulissa, because he just couldn't grab the sword and go. And it's like he was the perfect and the worst person to send to do this job. Like, he was both at the same time. But with Peter and the others going back for the sword, they of course get into it with Ulick, and then security gets involved again, which brings back Cosmo, which at this point, like, it even has Peter thinking like, this is all ridiculous. Like, talking raccoons and dogs, like, what are we doing here? But it's here where things calm down a little bit that we find out that Ulick didn't know that his sister was here. And in addition, we also find out, like, who sent Ulick in the first place, who as it turns out was Uatu the Watcher, which then kind of begs the question, like, if Uatu knew that Ulissa was here, like, he had to have known of how, like, Ulick was going to respond to that, because he's the Watcher. Like, how could he not know? But when Uatu arrives here, like, he doesn't even get into all that, but instead he lets him know, like, why he had sent Ulick to get the sword, and it's here where he tells him that the ebony blade is needed to destroy Knull. Alright, so jumping in, like, at this point, Spider-Man, Monica Rambeau, Rocket Raccoon, and Kang the Conqueror, they all came together and they stopped Mr. E, although most of the work was done by Monica Rambeau. But nonetheless, they pulled it off, but then with stopping him, they then took him to the Collector, and with doing so more so as a solution for imprisonment rather than Kang's solution, which was just kill this guy. But then Peter was like, no, this is a living creature, it would be better just to lock him up rather than just murder this thing and go on about our day. And that's what they did. They took him to the Collector and they went back and got the Ebony Blade, which is when the Watcher then revealed his involvement by telling Peter and the others that he had sent Ulick to retrieve the Ebony Blade. And we'll talk about more of his reasoning of why in just a little bit. But then it's also here where we go back to the Collector's showroom to where we see Mr. E say a little prayer to the God of the Abyss. And when he did, Knull answered his prayer. And Knull answered very reluctantly, might I add. But even with doing so, he answers the request of Mr. E for him to be restored to his full power, which is pretty much granting Mr. E with the ability to move around without needing a host so that he can find and destroy the Ebony Blade, which is still out there. And when this happens, of course, the Collector, he's just looking like, what in the retroactive continuity is happening here? Like, what exactly am I looking at? But nothing happens with the Collector. Mr. E gets out and he's back on his journey to get the Ebony Blade. But then it's here where we jump back over to nowhere, to where we see Peter like he clearly knows that it's 5 o'clock somewhere. And I'm pretty sure somebody's gonna be in the comments like, no, it's nowhere, K-N-O-W. Like, it's nowhere, not nowhere. Like yeah, I know. Where? But at this point, after retrieving the Ebony Blade, running into Ulick once again, and the Watcher returning, it's here where the Watcher tells him, like, after seeing the future concerning Knull and what's to come, the Watcher understands that this Ebony Blade, it can play a critical role in that. And this is why he took it upon himself to get Ulick to retrieve the Ebony Blade, because he knows that in the right hands that this sword could really do some damage, which is something we got a glimpse of within the King in Black Black Knight tie-in when we had seen the Black Knight use the Ebony Blade in the future. But even in this case, the Watcher's not referring specifically to the Black Knight, and in no way is the Watcher implying that he would use it himself, which he makes clear when he reminds them that he's sworn to only observe. And I guess like in the case of the Watcher, like hiring some help, that's considered observing, so let me write that down. But with the Watcher making his statement on observation, air quotes, Kang quickly volunteers himself to be the person to wield the Ebony Blade, because I mean, why not? I mean, like, this is his opportunity to shoot his shot. But even with Kang volunteering, Monica reminds them that the use of the Ebony Blade is something that's been suited best for the Black Knight, which at this time is an issue since the Black Knight is on the injured list, and Peter at this point is well on his way to the achievement unlocked status of alcohol poisoning. But with Peter once again throwing back his drinks and re-evaluating the ridiculousness of this entire scenario, and in the tone of just playing with the argument between Monica and Kang, and he more or less tells them like, if they want to get hostile, we can do that. Bring on Shadow Boy. And as soon as Peter says that, Mr. E enters the lobby. And when he gets there, the first thing that Mr. E does is he takes the Ebony Blade from the Watcher, which is a huge flex by the way, and not so much by taking the Ebony Blade from the Watcher, but with palming the Watcher's head. Like, I'd imagine that a lot of energy and concentration was spent for Mr. E to achieve such a task. But seriously, but it's here where Peter, he pulls himself back in and he takes a swing at Mr. E, because after their last fight, Peter and his symbiote have pretty much figured out how to make contact with Mr. E, which for the most part was really just a trial and error type of thing, with Peter realizing while he was fighting that he needed to let go and let the symbiote figure it out, to where at that point it was more of a matching frequencies type of thing. And it feels weird kind of making that comparison between like a symbiote and a shadow creature's frequency, but I guess when you think of it of light having a frequency which then has its different wavelengths, to where like there's only so much we can see in the middle before it's too low in infrared or too high in ultraviolet, and in this case somewhere along those lines, Mr. E, he still lands somewhere on some frequency which allows the symbiote to at least find it at some point where it's at. But with Peter making contact and punching Mr. E out of the bar, like out the window, Mr. E then goes on to tell him like he's on his way to destroy the galaxy. And when he says that, Peter's more or less like, well, I guess that makes us the Guardians of the Galaxy. And Monica quickly tells him like, pretty sure that's another group, which at this time I believe was very much a 31st century type of thing. But either way, Rocket's like, shut up, I like it, I'm taking it. And it's kind of just brushed over from there. But this time around with Mr. E coming back, they all then try to use the previous method which they had used to capture him the last time. And when this happens, it's very much like it's something that Mr. E had figured out when Peter had drew contact with his first punch that had knocked Mr. E out of the bar. Because now that Knull has fully restored him, he's not stuck to the limitations of either needing a host or just being completely helpless without one. And this is why with trying to capture him again, they're once again in uncharted territory. with nothing working, and even Monica's light frequency that she used before, like it's doing nothing now. But with this happening, like Peter, he goes for the smartest move in the room, like he just goes for the blade, because it makes sense, like if you can't touch him, just take the blade. But even with Peter webbing the blade, like just 1-to-1, he's not stronger than the full version of Mr. E. But even at this time, like the Watcher, who's been watching this whole time, he then starts to approach Mr. E. And when he does, Mr. E just kind of looks at him like, hey, what are you doing? You supposed to be watching. Like that's all you're supposed to do, you can't interfere. But with him continuing to approach Mr. E is pretty much like, what am I supposed to do, cower because you watching closer? And he just asks the Watcher, like, what are you gonna do? And the Watcher's just like, watch me. And he just blasts Mr. E with his cosmic rays. And when this happens, it's kind of like, well, okay, well they did come from his eyes, so technically the Watcher was watching. But even still, at this point, we all know good and well that the Watcher, like his vow to never interfere, like it means nothing, because if he feels that he needs to, he will. But with this happening and Mr. E losing his grip of the ebony blade, Rocket jumps in, catches it, and stabs Mr. E immediately. And when this happens, it does absolutely nothing. But Mr. E, he puts on a bit of a show like he is dying, as if like he was actually in pain. And like right away in my mind, like my mind just goes right back to Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And this is a throwback because it came out like in 92 or 93, but this film had to have had the most over dramatized, not really dead death scene that I've ever seen in a film, because the dude took a stake to the heart and just kept coming back. And I think he was even still dying in the post-credit scene, which was just genius humor, like it was so unexpected, and probably Joss Whedon's idea at the time. But then it's very comparative to here with everyone seeing Rocket Raccoon stab Mr. E with the ebony blade, because effectively that was supposed to kill him. But when it doesn't kill him, it's here that they realize that it's who wields the ebony blade that plays a big part on how effective it is, or even what effect it takes when it's being used. And when this happens, the Watcher gives Monica Rambeau a very Doctor Strange Endgame look, which is more or less that look of, okay, that's where you come in. And when this happens, the result is very different when Monica Rambeau takes the ebony blade from Mr. E, stabs him with it, and overcharges him with ultraviolet light, which in this case only works with the addition of the ebony blade. And when this happens, we see the destruction of Mr. E, which could be a permanent thing moving forward. Like this could be like the death of Mr. E, which I'm pretty sure it is, but if not, we'll probably see something where he was sent like to the shadow dimension, who knows. But then after this, like with the Watcher, who's capable of time travel, like he tries to take Monica into the future, into your current King in Black event to where she can face off with Knull, but it doesn't work, and Uatu tells him that it's because the other Watchers, they're preventing him from stepping in and making this change. But even with this being the case, like you and I know good and well that somewhere Marvel's editor-in-chief, CB Cebulski, is just like, hey, I can't go for that. And that's the real reason why the Watcher's time travel didn't work here. Because with it being Symbiote Spider-Man within itself, like these narratives have to be super self-contained. But as the reader, we go in knowing that, like it's to be expected. But with the time travel solution not working, they all then head back to Earth, and Monica then uses the ebony blade to destroy the eclipse that is in front of Earth's sun, which Knull had used Mr. E to bring forth, which was like your Shadow Realm manifestation of a ripple in time, which Mr. E was supposed to use to release Knull sooner. But then also, like with destroying it, Monica says, whoever you are, I hope you feel this, which very much feels like a reference to what Dylan would say much later on. But also with this happening, Knull did feel it, and it did hurt, and he goes on to mention that whoever did this, they'll live to regret it, but they won't live very long. And it more or less gives us the indication that Knull has it out for Monica Rambeau, which I doubt that we'll see play out within the conclusion of King in Black, because personally I just want to see Eddie on every page of that issue. But it does give us the indication of Knull's interest in the ebony blade, and also him having it out for Monica Rambeau. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all of your support. And for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below to where you can go to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. So everything ends, everything's back to normal, and the Watcher pretty much erased everyone's memories, so that way history is not affected by the remnants of these events. And I gotta say, like personally, I was kind of waiting for Peter Parker to go up against Knull in some way or capacity, but I also kind of feel like with the extra tie-ins and the finale being pushed back to next week, that it really just seems like some things were changed here that otherwise would have played out differently. And really, I have no additional information to like solidify that theory or that thought, but it was just one of the things that I took away from it reading this series in its entirety. But either way, let me know your guys' thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again in the next one. Alright, Later.